The following keynote address will take place in a forum that's a dialogue between Dr. Nkosana Moyo and Harvard Business School professor Catherine Duggan. Please come to the stage. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Nkosana Moyo here with us today. Dr. Moyo is the founder and executive chairman of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, and he's also the former Minister of Industry and International Trade of Zimbabwe. Until August 2011, he was a vice president and chief operating officer at the African Development Bank. And prior to that, he worked at Actis Capital as a managing partner for the African business. For 3 years, Dr. Moyo was a co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Africa Regional Agenda Council. He is currently on the board of trustees of the Investment Climate Facility and the Africa Leadership Institute. Dr. Moyo has served as an advisory board member of the London Business School, as well as the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Dr. Moyo holds a PhD in physics from the University of London and an MBA from the Cranfield School of Management in the UK, and is an Eisenhower Fellow. He is happily married with 2 lovely children, and on this picturesque and snowy day, please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Nkosana Moyo.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Moyo, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your career. It's a very interesting career. You started in physics.
Yeah.
Did you plan this out when you started this?
Absolutely not. Maybe let's go even further before the physics bit. Because, I'm sure that students here, especially from Africa, or just people who are from Africa, might identify and also understand what is possible. I'm born and bred in a rural setting, so I grew up in a region called Mberengwa in Zimbabwe. And I grew up in a peasant farming family. I grew up without shoes, no running water, no electricity. I used to run to school, maybe take about 30 minutes to just one way in winter and what have you. And when I tell my kids these stories, they can't quite deal with it. So I took them on a drive to go see where I went to primary school. And I say to them, this is the distance I used to walk to school. And my daughter says, why didn't your father drive you? Just can't relate to it. Yeah? Very different worlds indeed. But how did I end up studying physics? Firstly, in an African context, at least the Africa I know, our parents regarded educating their kids in a similar manner to our Western parents regard putting money into a bank account. So they sacrifice absolutely everything to educate their kids. Because in the culture of extended family support systems, when you become an adult and work, you take over the role, the roles are reversed. So you are expected to look after your parents, relatives, or whatever. No questions asked, no payment expected, it's just you paying back. It's like they deposited money into a bank account and now they're getting payback. So that's how it was. My parents sacrificed everything. I was, I think, naturally curious. And I studied physics, not because I wanted to follow a particular career at all, but it just interested me. And I was very curious. I ended up doing very tough options at a university and doing research to explore the unknown, so to speak. And that's the nature of person I am.
Excellent. But then you didn't go into physics. So can you tell us a little bit about the decisions not to go into physics and to end up where you've been, public service, the private sector, and in nonprofit?
I actually did go into physics. So when I finished my university studies, I went back to Zimbabwe and became a physics lecturer. And I spent 3 years teaching physics at the University of Zimbabwe. My passion was still sort of solid state physics related, so I did a lot of solar energy work. but resources were not available. And so my passion in terms of doing physics research, solar energy research, just could not be funded. So I got frustrated and left and went into industry and commerce.
And so,
yeah.
So at the end, you had to make a decision about whether to stay or whether to stay in physics or whether to make a life somewhere else. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, but once I couldn't get money for funding the research I wanted to do, I suppose I came to a crossroads really, and I decided maybe I should just start something else, and I went into, like I say, commerce and industry in Zimbabwe. After 3 years, I decided that, because it was a gamble, to be honest with you, academic and now going into industry and commerce, completely didn't know whether the transition would work. After 3 years, I decided it had worked, but I still needed to consolidate that transition. So I took a year off and went back to the UK, to Cranfield, to do an MBA. And in my MBA, given that I was not financially literate, if you like, I decided to focus on doing quite a number of options which were finance oriented. Went back to TA, that's the company I was working for. And we were doing a transaction with Cummins, actually, Cummins Engine, who wanted to come into Zimbabwe. And at that time, you couldn't go to the central bank, and there were exchange controls. You couldn't go directly to the central bank. You had to go through your advisory bank. So we went with our investment bankers to the central bank to discuss this transaction, which had all sorts of problems because of the exchange controls. And in that conversation, my boss and I went with the bank to the central bank, and I managed to come up with a solution. And the bank then decided that maybe I could be trained to become a financier. So they poached me. And that's how my banking career started. Yeah. So I joined Standard Chartered Bank in Zimbabwe. But the deal was, because I was not coming from a financial background, I wanted to go back to London, spend time in London for a couple of years, learning finance properly, and then go back to Zimbabwe, and that's what we did.
Terrific. And let's jump ahead a little bit, because then you changed careers again and ended up being a minister under one, you were called to service for your country, under one of Africa's most controversial leaders. Can you tell me a little bit about that decision to end up in the ministry?
Well, before we get to that, because I think it's related. So my last posting with Standard Chartered was in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. I was running a fairly small bank, but we were doing very well. And now some of the people sitting in this room are not going to like what I'm going to say. So I was working for a foreign company on African soil and doing very well. And I was in the top 50 in terms of seniority managers of Standard Chartered. So I was supposed to be a good manager. And as a manager of an international organization, it was my responsibility to figure out how to declare as much dividend as possible to send it to the shareholders, which was out of Africa. And for some reason, it got to me that, in fact, I was not doing anything for my continent this way. And I figured that if I was supposed to be such a good manager, then I needed to figure out a different mechanism for helping my continent. So I resigned from Standard Chartered and went back to Zimbabwe and started a venture capital company meant to service SMEs. And I did that for 4 years. But during that time, it was clear to me that the country was beginning to go downhill. And wanting to do something, contribute to what was going on, I actually wanted to run as an independent. I wanted to run for parliament as an independent, because fundamentally, I've got a problem with party politics in emerging markets, because I don't think they are functioning. So I wanted to become an independent, because my view was, if I'm in parliament as an independent, I will not be bound by party discipline. I will support what I know to be right, as opposed to just following a party line. I went campaigning, and my friends turned to me and said, you know what, Nkosana, we think you'd make a very good MP, but we're not going to vote for you. All of them, politely, golfing friends, what have you, they said, but we're not going to vote for you. So I said, oh, why? So they said to me, where this country is at the moment, what we want is a change of government. Independent ministers don't change governments, or independent MPs do not change governments. They said, if you join the opposition, you will walk to parliament because we'll vote for you. Outside of that, we're not voting for you. I think it was the first time I confronted the conflict, or what it means. Often when we're sitting outside, we say, so-and-so cannot be advised. But I don't think we really know what that means. So here I was, I had certain beliefs. And here was a constituency whose logic I could absolutely not deny. I could understand their logic. And so should I do what they want and become less of who I am? Or should I say to them, you know what, I agree with you, but I don't believe in going that way. And that's what I decided to do. So I did not run. I decided I believed in my model, and I still think I'm right. But I also had to be honest and say to them, I also understand what you're saying. You're being very logical, but I cannot function in that space. But unbeknown to me, the ZANU guys were watching all this. And the elections happened, and after the elections, my brother-in-law comes to me one Saturday and says, by the way, do you know that you're being announced as a minister? And I said, not possible, because nobody's talked to me. He said, just watch TV tonight. So there I am, Saturday evening, I go watch TV, and I'm duly announced as the Minister of International Trade and Industry. Without anybody having consulted me.
Now, let me ask you, is that the sort of thing that you could turn down? Did you have any notion in your mind that perhaps you didn't want to do that or shouldn't do that?
I had to think long and hard and consult family, consult friends, and most of my friends actually advised me against doing it. But given that I had already tried to run for parliament, you can see that I was looking for ways to contribute to what was going on in my country. So I decided, against advice again, I decided to join the cabinet. So I went and met with the president and asked him to explain what he had in mind. So we had a good conversation, actually. He explained, and he also explained why he hadn't talked to me. Or at least he gave me a... So what happened, incidentally? I walk in. As I walk in, he laughs. And he says, we ambushed you, didn't we? So I don't know what he meant by that, but that's what he said. His exact words, we ambushed you, didn't we? Then he apologizes and says, no, I'm joking. And he explains why he didn't talk to me, why he didn't consult me in advance. He says, you know what? He claimed that he had been, because I had been writing quite a number of articles in a financial paper about what I thought should be done in the country, how it should be managed and so on. So he claimed that he'd been following and reading these articles. And they said to me, therefore, I took a risk that you would be prepared to try and help your government if the opportunity, your country, if the opportunity was offered. And because I ran out of time in terms of consulting with all of the other ministers, I took a risk with you. I hope I was right. What can you say? So I said, fine, let's give it a go and see. And so I joined cabinet.
And so tell us a little bit about being in that situation, about being in the cabinet of a president with whom you've had some ideological disagreements.
Yeah, but I think again we need to be clear. Did I have ideological differences with Mugabe? I think not at that stage. If you go back to the time in question, you'll find that the most controversial issue was the issue of land. You will also find that most institutions, including the World Bank, actually had no problem with the ideological position of redistribution of land. The issue which arose later on was the methodology. It was the methods as opposed to the fundamental issue of land redistribution. So I don't think I had an ideological problem with him.
So the implementation rather than...
The implementation.
Right. So then tell me a little bit about being in a position where you're working inside an organization and having to make a decision, because in the end you decided to leave again. So tell me a little bit about that decision to leave and the ways in which maybe some of the frustrations as well as some of the opportunities of being inside an organization like that, inside the government like that.
So part of this requires almost like my own, I suppose, characterization of what my experience of President Mugabe. I had a very good relationship with him. I had access to him, and that access, incidentally, also comes from a story. When he announced me as a minister, and I tried to go and see him, his front office would not give me an appointment. They gave me the runaround. Until the secretary to cabinet facilitated for that meeting to happen. So I go and have this meeting with him, and as you can imagine, there is a secretary taking minutes. At the end of our conversation, I asked him a couple of questions, which were quite tricky. And one of them was, by the way, is it a problem when your ministers want to come and see you? So he says, oh, no, it shouldn't be. So I said, but it was virtually impossible for me to make this appointment, and I told him everything. And I think the secretary who was taking the minutes assessed that in the whole system, I suspect she went and talked to her colleagues. Because until I left cabinet, the only office which if I called, my call was returned within 30 minutes was the president's office. The only one. Other ministers might call you back, they may not, they may call you back the following day. But in the president's case, every time I needed to talk to him, I had access. If he was busy, within 30 minutes, he would call me back. So I had a very good relationship with him. But I think also the system around him assessed my personality. I'm a very open person. I don't play games. I say what I think. And so my relationship with President Mugabe was based on that, was based like that. So whether it was in cabinet or not, I would politely tell him what I thought and disagree with him. And he had no problem with it at all. So we had a very good relationship.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And so then tell me a little bit about why you decided to resign, please.
Why I decided to resign. So the land issue happens. And I remember distinctly, a Chinese delegation came to Zimbabwe because I was the Minister of Industry. A Chinese delegation which had built, the Chinese had built a cement factory in Zimbabwe. They come to visit to see how this is working. I am the minister responsible. Then we have a courtesy call on the president. And then at that point I asked him, I said, you know what, I would like to see you, but outside of the normal working hours because I want some quality time with you. There are things which are bothering me. So he said to me, you know what, and the following day was going to be Heroes Holidays in Zimbabwe. It may not mean anything to you, but there is an event. He was going to go to Heroes Eka in the morning and what have you. And the whole afternoon he said to me, I am going to be in the office, so why don't you come and we can have a conversation about what's bugging you. So I went and saw him and we spent, I don't know, maybe 2-3 hours together. And my main issue was again a view which I wanted to put to him about dealing with the land issue. And it was very straightforward. I said to him, you know what, I think you've made your point about the fact that land needs to be redistributed. I also think, however, that it would be healthy to get the white community to be part of working out a solution as opposed to them sitting on the sidelines as victims. So I said, I made a very distinct proposal. I said to him, why don't you find a white commercial farmer and make him a deputy minister of agriculture? He stopped and thought, and then he said, it could work. He said, but I've got a problem. The system, the constitution at that point allowed for the appointment of ministers who had not run for parliament. But there was a provision which gave him, I think, about 12 parliamentary seats, because if you were appointed a minister without actually being an MP, you still had to become an MP in order to be a minister. So he would use these unelected 12 positions to make you an MP in order for him to appoint you as a minister. He said to me, my problem is that I've run out of those 12 seats. So technically I can't do it. And I said, you know what, I think that's a technicality we can work around. You would achieve exactly the same thing if you found such a white commercial farmer, appointed him as a senior advisor in your office. The signal to the world and to the country would be exactly the same. So he said, consider it done. He went back to the party and they said, you must be crazy. I mean, they wouldn't have said that, but it was not done. And a number of other occasions where I would have a conversation with him, we would agree on something, but I think the party system would get in the way. It just got me realizing that in spite of me having a good relationship with him and him agreeing to things that I suggested, but because I was not a party member, I had no leverage on my cabinet colleagues in the party. So I was ineffective in that sense, if you like to put it very bluntly. So I decided I was wasting my time, and I decided to leave.
That's very interesting. So based on that experience, would you say that as a general rule, you think that it's more effective to work for change from within an organization or from outside the organization?
I don't think you can generalize. I don't think there's a general answer. I would say, firstly, you should not ever get yourself involved in anything and think you can change it as an individual. I think you need a certain critical mass of colleagues to work with you, support each other, bat ideas, and so on and so on. So even in a cabinet, you need to make an assessment of who else in that cabinet thinks the way you do, believes in the same things that you believe in, because then you can work together as a team. If you're on your own, I think more often than not, it won't work. Yeah? So I would say yes, but it depends on the circumstances. And also it depends on whether you've got other colleagues who can do it with you. I think when we're talking about things which are evolutionary rather than revolutionary, working from inside must make some sense. It must make sense. Yeah, but I think you have to take care of all of these other issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so let's jump forward again, and I'll ask you about Minds. And I'll ask you to tell me a little bit about your decision to found Minds and the sort of work that you're doing now.
Yeah. Now, so let me go back. This morning I came into this room to listen to the opening keynote. And Eva mentioned that she's a half-full kind of person and so on and so on, yeah? And I thought to myself, you know, I know for a fact that I'm a half-empty kind of person. And I thought, is that such a bad idea? I thought, no, but it means we complement each other, right? So, and I tell you that because I think Minds comes out of an assessment, a personal assessment from me, that Africa is not doing as well as a lot of people believe it is. And what I call Africa goes, I suppose, back to 60 years when the first African countries became independent. In my opinion, in my assessment, Africa has failed to deliver to its citizens since then. And in the past decade, people look at gross numbers and they say GDPs are growing and it looks good. My definition of success is to create a linkage between plans laid, plans executed, and results that then come out of the execution of those plans. When there is no causal relationship, I don't think you should take credit for those outcomes. What has been happening in Africa in the past decade is that, yes, the numbers are looking good, but when you look at the causal relationship, I would argue that those numbers are coming out of mostly external or exogenous factors. So how can we then say that Africa is doing well? How can we argue that this is sustainable? Maybe even that is not the biggest issue I have. The biggest issue I have is that we as Africans do not appear, firstly, to acknowledge that fact, and secondly, to engage in conversations to try and interrogate what's going on. For me, what that means is, if we're not engaged in a dialogue to try and explore, firstly, why are we where we are? What are the forces that are causing that to happen? And how are we going to fix it? How can we ever hope that Africa will work right? It's got to be a conscious investment in understanding where we are, how we've come to be where we are, and what we're going to do to change things that need to be changed in order to see us go forward. And on that assessment, I decided I was going to not just protest, talk about it, but I was going to do something about it. So we formed such a platform.
Terrific. Now, why do you think that conversation hadn't been going on before?
I really don't know. I think actually what we tend to do, I think there are two reasons. One of the reasons why we are where we are factually is colonization. But I think we have fallen into a trap of not maturing beyond blaming colonization. That's point number one. Point number two, I think outsiders are all too ready to come and tell us what's not working. And human beings naturally get defensive in that situation. I can't come to your home and tell you that your son is I don't know, whatever, you know, you get defensive. Okay? So I think those are the key reasons why we have stayed defensive and failed to take ownership of interrogating this issue and coming up with solutions. But I think we can do something about it.
So one of the things that people often talk about, and this is something that I've seen over and over in my own work, is this difference between what we hear in the general media and the difference between what we see on the ground. And there's often a sort of an effort to make the glass half full, to sort of counterbalance some of the things that we hear in the media. Are you ever afraid that in having a more honest, more balanced discussion, that that's actually going to create problems for, or it's going to feed into this negative idea of what's going on?
Well, so I studied physics, and I have to be very honest with you, I'm not sure what the causal relationship is. Did I study physics because I'm who I am, or have I become who I am because I studied physics? I don't know. But I do not run away from facts. I think the only way I can change my situation is to confront those facts, no matter how unpleasant. I think there is a way in which you can have a conversation about unpleasant things and have that conversation in a civilized way. I think that's the only thing that's worth addressing. Have the conversation you must, but how you engage in that conversation, absolutely. I think you can be civilized about it. So, and I think political correctness often gets in the way. Yeah, I think there are also a number of other issues, you know. So again, it gets a bit unpleasant. We come from a situation where we've got colonization. And I think we get a situation where maybe the former colonial countries get a guilt conscience. And they engage with helping, aid starts, and so on and so on. But when people are paying money for something, I come from banking, so I understand this. When you're paying for something, it is very difficult to escape having to be very conditional about it. So you start saying, whether you articulate it or not, it's my money after all. Therefore, I maneuver to get things done the way I would like them done. And I think this dynamic has also contributed to what's going on in Africa today. The donor community comes into Africa. They create circumstances where, because it's my money, in fact, our politicians have learned to play a game. They tell them what they want to hear, they get the money, and nothing ever changes. But there is a charade going on both sides. I tell you what I want, you say you're going to do it, I give you the money, you don't do it, but I continue to give you the money anyway, right? So, and I think we need to find a way of breaking this. Firstly, on the African side, I think we need to accept that when somebody is giving you money, there is no free lunch. If I'm a bank and you come to me with a project, I've got every right to say to you, actually, in this institution, we will not support this kind of project. Go talk to somebody else. There is nothing wrong with that. On your part, don't ever get yourself in a position where if I withdraw my money, your country goes bust. Never, never do that. So for me, I think there is a recalibration that is required to establish a mature relationship. And that's required by both sides. Is that a dialogue that people can have? Absolutely. When I talk at investment conferences, I put this straight on the table. And I've not seen anybody getting violent with me. So I think, I think it can be done.
And so you mentioned that a lot of people are coming in and telling people what to do in Africa. And obviously we've all seen this. How do some of the organizations like WEF or HBS talk about what could be done? What is their role in this without coming in and being explicit about what Africa should do, but working with people in the continent to try and build capacity?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you something about mines again in a way. My view at the moment is that Africa is the only continent which is attempting to develop itself on the basis of a completely alien institutional framework. So what do institutions like yours do? You come to Africa and tell us what we should do. How do we formulate what you tell us what we should do? You tell us what we should do according to your own experience. But what is your experience in terms of how it relates to the reality which is African on the ground? It's in most instances, in most instances, it is zero. I gather you've worked in Uganda, okay? So, but in most instances, it's zero. And am I blaming the people who are doing this? No, we've got to mature and take responsibility. And let me just expand on this because it's really a passion with me. And I'm going to give you an example. Let's take law. What's your discipline?
Political science.
Oh, not law. Okay, but you'll understand. So if you go, imagine going to a very remote village, anywhere in the world, remote, the people living in that village have never seen the inside of a classroom. What you'll find, as soon as there is a community of people, there will be a codification of how those people relate to each other. It's just part of society. That's what happens. On the other side, our learned friends in law tell us that you cannot ever plead ignorance against the law. So you are expected to know. Right? So when I take those two things and put them together, logically for me it says, if I'm developing a legal system, a constitution, anything legal for a particular community, I have to make that legal institutional framework accessible to everybody, including my grandmother who has never seen the inside of a classroom. It's got to make sense to them in terms of how they want to regulate their affairs with each other within their community. Now, what we've done in Africa is take pride when we listen to people like you tell us how to do it according to how you do it in your own country for your own community. And what we do in that one move is to alienate the bulk of our people. The institutions that we form have got nothing to do with them. At best, they are for the educated and the elite. But what percentage are we? If we're talking about changing our countries, we must do things that are accessible by the bulk of the people. Then those institutions become instruments in their hands to participate in economic activity in the country. Law is a facilitator, finance is a facilitator, but we take it and make it completely alien, inaccessible. Surely that cannot make sense. Yeah? So that's a very simple example. So when you ask me, how do you tell us what to do? I would urge that you always remember this example. So, and am I saying, and when I say this, some of my friends will say, but Nkosana, are you trying to say we should go primitive and stay there? The answer is absolutely not. What I am saying, we need to create institutions that our people can relate to, and those institutions then naturally will evolve with those societies. That's what everybody else does. That's what everybody else does. And it's interesting to note as well that those who are here from Africa will know this for a fact. When you want a passport, when you want a visa, the level of compliance in Africa with anything institutional is incredibly low. And you need to ask yourself why this is the case. Why does Africa have a problem with compliance with its own institutions? Does this make sense? There must be a reason. What is the reason? I think it's alienation. People don't relate to them.
So then how do we turn that around? How do we start that process?
I think what we should be doing is go back. In fact, we don't even have to go back. We don't even have to go back. The reason why we don't have to go back, when you go to any typical African country, the majority of the people, by and large, live in the rural areas. And these people actually still live their lives according to traditional culture. That's how they regulate their affairs. But we, the elite, have jettisoned and imposed on the countries institutions from France, from UK, and so on and so on. So we've tried to create institutions for ourselves. But even we actually don't understand them because the evidence shows that we can't manage them. We don't manage them properly. So what we need to do is go back to our communities. Not go back in time, go back to our communities. Understand how they regulate their own affairs. Analyze and get them engaged and identify those practices which have got relevance and which can be used and modernized to underpin our modern institutions. And engage with them also to discard those practices that we think would hold us back. That's all we need to do. Then we're going to get buy-in, ownership, familiarity, and access by the population. Yeah.
So let me then ask you one last question before we open it up to questions, which is, what advice would you give the people sitting in this room about how to begin that process, about what to do if they're passionate about going back to Africa, about changing Africa for the better? What advice would you give them for that?
Well, firstly, I would say you have to look inside you and try to be honest. And I'm going to give them a sort of an example, anecdotal example, which is fascinating, actually. So all of us watch TV. I think pretty well all of us in here watch TV. And you know, it's fascinating what I see. At least some of my African friends have admitted this to me. And I'm included, yeah? I'm included, so I'm not excluding myself. When I'm watching TV and an African presenter speaking in English or French doesn't speak the language properly, I cringe. It's like, you know, you are incompetent. That's almost like automatic reaction. What is fascinating though, is if a Chinese, Japanese, Italian, German does exactly the same, I intuitively understand that it's not their language, so why should they be competent? It's fascinating. So I think you have to look for these, because it's easy to deny. What I'm really saying is that we have ended up in a very bad place, where we are ashamed of who we are. We deny ourselves. And as a result, we're spending all our time trying to be somebody else. Now, if you go from today, go to England, go to Germany, go to France, go to Italy, as you walk into those countries, there is something intangible about them which tells you, if you're in Germany, you are not in Paris, you're not in France. If you're in Japan, you are not in Shanghai or China. You know there is an essence about the people. They absolutely go and learn from other people's practices. But what they do with the learnings is come and bolt them onto a platform which defines who they are. That's what we have to do. We have to reclaim and stop being ashamed of who we are. And then we'll learn from the world, but in a mature and healthier way, and apply and sift and we have more discretion about what it is we try to do. That's what we need. That would be my advice. So do it in your own privacy, examine.
And so, at a very practical level, lots of people in this room, I think, are thinking about whether they should be going into the private sector, the public sector, and at what stage in their lives that might be the best thing to do. What advice would you give them on that? Yeah.
Again, I hesitate to be prescriptive, but let me use the UK as an example. I'm not a student of history, but my little understanding of the evolution of government in the UK is that the landed gentry in the UK used to send their sons in particular to 3 careers or professions: the army, the church, and government. They sent their sons to these things not to make a living as such, but to protect the assets that they already had. Yeah? Now, that starting point creates a completely different trajectory of the process of governance. We in Africa, our reality is different. Our reality is that in most of our countries, the people who've ended up in government have not, up to that point, accumulated any capital. So they go in, but they've got absolutely nothing to their name. And then they go in there, they've got families, they've got commitments, they've got to have a house for their family, send kids to school. The salaries that they are paid are very low. So if you imagine leaving college and going straight into that situation, I suspect we'll continue to have a problem. So my own advice would be, we need a shift, we need a crop of Africans who, when they come out of college, go and work, accumulate capital, put themselves in a position where they can actually support their families, and they go into government for service, not to make a living.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to open up for questions. We have microphones down here and here. If you could please come up and form a line to ask questions. I'll ask you to keep your questions as short and concise as possible, please, and to make them questions rather than statements, please. So, if you have questions, you're more than welcome to come down. All right, yes, please.
Yes. Hi, my name is Muhammad Abdurshid. I'm actually from region from Somalia. So one question I have is, you touched to the point where that if we're going to go back to our roots, especially governance, and in order to make things transparent, tackle corruption, and things like that. With the past 15, especially 10 years, with the introduction of mobile technology, tablets, things like that, what type of tools do we need to use to introduce things to make it more transparent, and also to execute those tools if you want to go back to those roots that you were just talking about from a community perspective. So what do you think technology will play to take part of that role?
Let me try and answer your question more broadly. So in about 2 months' time, Minds is going to hold a dialogue which we're going to hold just with young people. So who is young? 35 and below. Okay? That's how we've defined it. And the reason why we've decided to do this, about 65% of the African population is in that category. it is our opinion that if somehow we can mobilize young people who also incidentally happen to be ICT competent, broadly, more than people like me, yeah? So if we can mobilize them and try to make them understand that the future of Africa, by and large, depends on their consciousness in terms of how they play or don't play a role. Let me give you an example. If you go to any African country where elections tend to be accompanied with violence, who are the foot soldiers who go beating up people? It is you people sitting in this room. I'm saying that in terms of age, not you personally. You know? Okay. So it's young people. Now, if young people constitute such a big number, so just statistically, if young people were to make it a point to participate in elections, and they use their competence in terms of ICT to support each other across boundaries, incidentally. Again, this issue of nation states, I think it's completely mistaken. So you sit here, you say you are networking. Networking to do what exactly? Yeah? So once you start understanding that Africa is a continent, and remember, we also argue, people will always tell you, oh, what is Africa? Africa is a continent, not a country. True, but most of the African countries shouldn't exist anyway, because if they were companies, they would go bust. Yeah? So, in your imagination of the kind of Africa you should be trying to create, do not wish those boundaries away because it's too complicated, but make them almost like exist and not of consequence. Trade should go on. You guys should be able to cross borders and visit each other. But it also means when their political process is next door, try to use the tools available to you, which you have got competence in, to support each other and make sure that those elections go the way they should go, to create a future for you. That's what I think you should do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Moyo. My name is Fanele Chester. I'm a Swazi student at the University of Chicago. I have a general question for you. So with regards to the youth in Africa in general, there was a report that said there's a 62% unemployment rate across the continent. And I believe one of the reasons why that is the case is that you have this disconnect between our parents and the young people. I believe that in communities before, in Africa generally, there were opportunities for young people to interact with older people, be it you're in the field, planting, you could interact with other older women, and that was a way of imparting knowledge about life, about how to be as a woman or as a man. And currently, those structures don't really exist. There's no opportunity for this informal but very essential connection between young and old people. How do you think we can recreate that? Because I think it's part of the reason why young people are so disconnected from their countries, from their communities in general. Thank you. Okay.
So you're asking me a question you should be answering, I think. No, I'm not being trivial. Huh? I think the solution, you see, part of, yesterday I had a coffee with 3 young people who I suspect are in here. And the conversation was fascinating because we tried to discuss what were problems with Africa. And it was interesting, just listening to the language they were using. The language they were using was self-excusing. It was about them, other people, about those other people. And I tried, and by the end of the conversation, I think I'd managed to get them to change from saying they to saying we. I hope that, in fact, in my comments today, you would have picked up that I am saying we because I think I'm part of the problem and part of the solution. The minute I start saying they, I will not involve myself. I will say they've messed it up, they must correct it. But when you're talking about intergenerational relationships, by definition for me, it means it takes the two sides. The young people learning to understand those historical practices or traditional practices, and on their part engaging to create the relationships that allow that to happen. It cannot be done from one side. It's got to be on both sides. I'll go further and put it this way. My parents hardly went to school. And my attitude in life has always been that my parents guided me, chided me, if you like, within the context of the sphere of their awareness. They then facilitated for me to go to school way beyond what they were capable of being aware of. So their guidance actually stopped very early on. I think it means, therefore, that I have got a responsibility to take on more of the load of creating the future, because I have had the exposure and I know what is possible beyond what they're capable of seeing. That's why I say, I think the people sitting in this room and all other young people, you've got an inordinate responsibility. It's not symmetrical. You've got more of a responsibility because of your awareness and education to find the solutions. And then to manage with sensitivity how to take the older generation with you. The responsibility is more in your hands, in my opinion. But your question is actually so broad. Let me give you another element of this question. At the moment, we've been seduced by a Western economic model. I'm not an economist, so I talk very commonsensically, okay? What fascinates me about the economic model we've adopted is that we consider growth as a god, literally. Everything but everything is predicated on things keeping growing. But if you think logically and mathematically, if everything grew the same way, we would actually stay exactly where we were before. Yes? Mathematically, that follows. If everything grows proportionately, you might as well stay where you were before. But an even more problematic issue for me, and I'm sort of Darwinian, yeah, is that we have socialized ourselves globally, which part of what supports this growth theory. We've socialized ourselves to run away from dying. We are not interested in the quality of life. We're interested in the longevity. Yeah? We want to live as long as possible. My attitude, and I've socialized my family to accept this, I've lived a good life. If I died, it's not an issue. Absolutely not. I've told my kids, my wife, to say, learn to celebrate my life, not its length. And if I die, it's fine. It's part of a natural process. But we collectively have gotten ourselves into a corner of running away from death. But if we run away from death, the carrying capacity of the globe and whatever, so the numbers keep exploding, so that's why everything has to grow. Yeah? Everything has to grow to keep up, to feed, and so on and so on. But why is this relevant to this question? We, I think, as Africans, never used to have this problem. But we also used to use the extended family as a social support system. And we have been seduced by the Western model where the nuclear family becomes it, not the social system. So all our social structures which helped to integrate what we're talking about intergenerationally are breaking down. Urbanization, nuclear family issues, part of it goes back to what I just said. Why are we allowing ourselves to simply mimic what other people do? Why don't we look at what Africa can teach the rest of the world, distill those things, and practice them firstly successfully, because your credibility depends on what you do successfully. Forget preaching to other people unless you can demonstrate it works, right? So the challenge we have is, let's go back and learn from our own traditions, implement them, and I think there is a lot of stuff that Africans used to do, which we could do, which would actually teach the world to adjust differently, as opposed to us thinking that we just takers of what the world has got to give. Yeah?
Dr. Moyo, thanks for sharing your experience here with us today. I've got two questions. One is on international aid. You touched on the issue of independence of African governments and being able to devise policies, independently, which has been stifled by the fact that, they depend on foreign governments for international aid. I'd like to get your assessment as to, how you feel African governments can win themselves of international aid, and whether you think, many countries or many governments are in a position now where they can get rid of international aid and, seek to finance themselves from domestic means. And the second issue I want to touch on is my personal frustration with the slow pace of integration, particularly economically within Africa. We still don't trade that very much. It's very burdensome, doing business from one country or one region of Africa, into another. It's difficult to travel from one place to another. I'd like to get your...
So let's...
From one country, sorry, from one country. Okay. From one African country to another, sorry.
So let's wrap this up, and I'll ask. So the questions on the table are about aid, and then the second about integration, about the integration of the continent.
Okay. Let me answer you back to front. So integration. You know what I was saying about elections and young people and networks? So let's go back. Why does Africa have a problem firstly with private sector? Historically, private sector in Africa was associated with colonization. So in our psyche, we actually only begrudgingly are creating space for the private sector, because we continue to identify business and private sector with the other world. But now, as you know, there is a lot of African entrepreneurs, African business people, very successful. I think the first point of tackling integration is for African business people to begin to understand diversification of risk within Africa and work with each other to create. Let's just take an example. Let's say you take countries that are contiguous, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And if the business people in those countries, indigenous that is, created a holdco and literally merged their businesses into this holdco, they get exposure. Each one of them now has got exposure to all of the other countries in the neighborhood, but all of them are equally exposed. These same business people, in terms of the quality of dialogue they can have with their governments as indigenous business people, changes completely. It's a completely different dialogue. So in terms of then facilitating, there may be a boundary, but once you start looking at the practical issues about integration, mobility of people, mobility of capital, trade, those things can be managed in spite of the boundaries by people first exposing, if you like, in terms of creating portfolios that raise the exposure or dilute country exposure, which then allows the politicians and the businessmen to have a completely different dialogue. That's how I would go about that particular issue. Now, your first question was about, just remind me again?
International aid.
It's independence from aid.
Yeah. So I think the starting point is, we again, and I'm not sure why, we've got ourselves believing that Africa is a poor continent. So let me go back to my youth. I told you I grew up without shoes, going to school without shoes, no running water, no television. But one thing I didn't tell you is that I never went hungry, not one day. When I therefore listen to the measures of poverty and look at my own upbringing, I cannot identify with what is being used as a measure of poverty. So there is almost like a brainwashing of what poor is, which I do not recognize. My family was not poor, in spite of not having those things. Yeah? And I think Africa needs to get itself into that same place to recognize the assets we have and understand our people, our land, our natural resources, water, and then say to ourselves, what is it that we can do with these assets? Why do we think we're poor? We are not poor. And so the attitude towards aid would change immediately. Once you don't regard yourself as being poor, you're not going to go with a begging bowl, are you? At the moment, we've got ourselves socialized to wanting to get things for nothing. There is no such thing. It just does not happen. It means we're not counting properly. Yeah? We think we're getting something and we're failing to keep track of what is being taken in return, because that is what's going on. We are paying for everything we're getting. We are not poor. So it's up here.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question.
I had a couple of questions for you, Dr. Moyo. I'm Sylvia Chimina from Zimbabwe.
We have time for one question.
Can I go now?
Sorry, yes?
Can I go now? Okay. So my question is, how do we bridge the gap between being educated as a people that have to go out and work for someone else to the place where we need to be executing and creating the businesses ourselves and taking the risks that are associated with that? Thank you.
But why, again, you see, are you a business student?
No, sir, I'm an head of strategy for Kenya.
Oh, even better, even better. So why aren't you telling me the answer? I think firstly, no, seriously. Firstly, our education system is broken, completely broken. We, again, are educating people to believe that going to school is to do with somebody else then giving you a job. We are not infusing enough of an entrepreneurial attitude in the people we educate. In other words, I go to school not in order for somebody to give me a job. I go to school so that I can educate myself about my environment and give myself the skills to identify opportunities, including opportunities to provide goods and services. And I think if we started working that way, even the sort of unemployment issues, the numbers will change immediately. So when you're spending your time in school, don't be saying, I'm doing it in order to go get a job. Do it in order to become more aware of what opportunities, including getting a job. I'm not excluding it, but the focus should move much more into what can I do with the skills I acquire to do and become an employer. Yeah?
All right.
I think that's what we should do.
I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. This is terrific. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.